Hello kind people, this is Svidler for Chess24, recording a highlight video of the round 10 of the Tata Steel 2019 tournament in Wijk, and for this video we will look at the game Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, played against the ex-world champion Vishy Anand, and this game had huge relevance in terms of what was going to happen in the tournament. They entered round 10 as co-leaders, sharing the first place with Jan Nepomniachtchi, whose game I believe Jan Gustafsson covered in not one but two languages before running away from the studio in panic. So it fell to me to cover the Carlsen Anand game, and it's a massive game both in terms of importance and simply in sheer volume. So let's proceed to the board. Magnus, as he I think generally does, goes 1e4 against Vishy. Vishy goes e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And here a slight surprise. Vishy of course plays all kinds of Spanish lines, but he generally prefers, I think, knight f6 these days, and they discussed this position a great many times prior to this one. But a6 generally signifies that Vishy, after bishop a4, knight f6, is planning to play the open. These days he returned to his roots, so to speak, and plays a lot of the open variation again. Well, a decent amount, let's put it like this. And this is not something that Magnus generally likes allowing, because it places a very heavy emphasis on memorization, and there are some forced lines spanning, I think, close to 30 moves in some cases. So we immediately started discussing during the live show with Jan whether Magnus will play d2, d3 here, for instance. But d3 does allow black, for instance, to play b5 and bishop c5, and this transposes in most cases to some Euretayev positions where white also ruled out playing the main lines with c3 and d4. And Magnus chooses a different sideline here. He goes knight c3, which is a move that is not very popular these days, but it has been played by the greats of yesteryear. Boris Spassky used to play this quite a bit, and of course it makes sense. And generally what you get here is it looks like it's exactly the four knights opening with the inclusion of a6, bishop a4, and we were making the argument during the live show that that inclusion makes the position so different that nobody would even dream of playing bishop b4 here, which is something that, of course, very much done in the classical four knights. Bishop b4 is still one of the two main moves, the other one being knight d4. But after knight c3, we were making the argument that both knight d4, because now knight takes e5 gains in strength compared to those other positions, and bishop b4 are rare to non-existent. And when checking the modern history of this particular subline of the Spanish, I found out that I think the most recent very high-level game of this variation actually featured the move bishop b4. That's a game between Adiban and Stevic, played in Zagreb in 2018, and it continues sort of along the lines of how the four-knight game would generally continue. And here Adiban went for a very unusual plan with knight d2 followed by c4 and then f4, and they had a very interesting game which ended in a draw. And another thing that I noticed is that this variation among the top players has been played, I think, by far the most by Linier Dominguez Perez, and people played all kinds of stuff against him. Karyakin played bishop b7 against him, for instance, which feels very logical, and they had a game in which Dominguez took on c6, took on e5, and black equalized reasonably comfortably after this typical tactical idea, and one of the knights will fall. Levon Aronian played b5, bishop b3, d6 against him, and was totally lost by move 8, which is not that easy to achieve. After knight g5, d5, knight takes d5. Black is probably advised to play knight d4 here, but instead Levon played knight bishop c5, which just immediately loses to knight takes f7. But this is all a bit of a historical overview, which is not that relevant to the game. I just wanted to give you an idea of what was happening in this variation prior to the game. Vishy goes bishop c5 first. Another thing that has to be mentioned, I guess, is that there are often still transpositions to the Urtayev. And for instance, after bishop c5, Magnus himself in Norway Chess 2016 played castles against Anish Giri. And after b5, bishop b3, castles d3, h6, knight d5, d6, c3, we did get a very, very standard position, which normally arises from the Urtayev variations, and which is not really supposed to be anything at all. And the game did indeed end in a draw, although Magnus had some pressure at some point. But today he chose a different approach. He just took on c6 here, dc and d3. And what we get here is a position which is very similar in spirit, so to speak, to anti-Berlins such as knight f6, d3, bishop c5, bishop c6, dc6. Black does have the move a7, a6 made in the game, but it generally doesn't do anything particularly good for him, so you can more or less disregard this. And the one big difference, of course, is that White played knight c3 in this position, which is not the main move here. The main move, I think, currently would be knight bd2. There's also a lot of theory connected with castles, but knight bd2 in particular is something that people play quite a lot, aiming to develop it to c4, sometimes to b3. And the position they have in the game is very notable by the fact that knight is already on c3. And here, in a reasonably recent game between Richard Rapport with White against Ding Liren, Ding just played castles here, which is very logical. And the intention then is to go rook e8, knight d7, knight f8, and try to bring it to e6 as soon as possible. And this is a very, very normal way of playing these types of variations. But Vishy goes for something slightly more, I would describe it as safe, but also not aiming maybe for immediate and complete equality. He played queen d6. It's worth noting that the pawn on e5 was not hanging yet, and this is why you can castle. Of course, White cannot take on e5 because queen d4, attacking these two pieces, is just not very good at all for White. So queen d6 appears not to be all that necessary, at least at this very moment. Magnus played h3, bishop e6. If White castles until Black determines where the king goes, it's very possible to get into quite severe trouble with White, because Black will probably castle in the opposite direction and then start pushing for the g5 break. We have seen this type of a situation in a very, very famous game between Levon Aronian and Vladimir Kramnik in the Berlin candidates last year. But of course Magnus knows all this, and he plays bishop e3 first. And this is a sort of an important minor turning point here, because I think the structure after bishop e3, fe3, and now you can play knight d7, you can play c5 first, you can castle either side. I don't think this is bad for Black at all. But Vishy goes for knight d7 without the capture on e3, which is, it leads to more clarified structures, but it also, I think, leaves White with a more fluid structure, and the plan becomes a lot more solidified for White. White takes on c5, knight takes, queen d2, and the idea becomes quite clear. White wants, in most cases, to castle short, push for d3, d4, hope to exchange the pawn on d3 for the pawn on e5, and then we get your typical, let's say, exchange Spanish endgame, in which White has a majority on the king side, whereas Black's majority on the queen side is not that mobile compared to White's, because the double pawns on the c-file make it very difficult for Black to create a passed pawn in the future. So let's say if you go d4, e4, knight takes d4, and then the game reaches a pawn endgame, that pawn endgame most likely will be lost for Black. But obviously this is extreme optimism. And in this position, Black could try playing for some slightly more complicated positions. You can castle long here. White probably also castles long. You can go knight d7, d4, and in this position there's even a somewhat tricky move knight b6, creating this big idea of knight c4 followed by queen b4. And if white takes on e5, f6, you have to go to d3 because knight f3, queen, knight c4 you already lost more or less. So you go knight d3, black takes on d4, and black is fine. But the smarter move after knight b6 is something like queen g5, preserving the situation in the center. For now it's sidestepping knight c4. After knight c4 you play a3, stopping queen b4 sort of the hard way. And this position probably favors white a little bit. But instead of all this fanciful stuff, you can just take on d4. White probably takes with the knight, and you can play f6. And this kind of a schoolboy understanding of white has an extra pawn here because of the black double pawn on the c-file. In modern chess, people have come to the understanding that this is extremely simplistic and frankly just not very true. And a position like queen e3, rook h8, of course white has every right to continue, but generally these positions have turned out to be very playable for black because it's very, very difficult to actually trade enough pieces to be significantly better here. So this was definitely an option. Vishy goes knight d7 instead, d4, and of course you can castle long once again in this position, which would lead to transpositions, castles, and we are back where I just described. But Vishy goes for immediate clarity, and I think this is also very much notable in his play these days, that he wants to know what's going on the board as early as possible, which is why he goes e d4, knight takes d4, c5, knight e6, and fe. And this is also, I think, a very, very decent practical decision. But later, I think his play could have been improved. Magnus castled here, queen takes d2, he took with the king. Generally, white, of course, wants the king somewhere on the e3 square. And here, I believe Vishy did not play in the manner that the position demanded. We were very curious during the live broadcast to figure out why he did not play a very standard for these types of positions move g7, g5, aiming obviously to land the knight on e5 and then not allow that knight to be chased away by the pawn on f4. And I looked at this for a bit with obviously the help of engines, and I couldn't really understand what could have scared Vishy from this decision. It seems like a very sensible, very solid decision in this position, and I do believe it should have been preferred to what he did. He went knight e5 instead immediately, and Magnus did not waste too much time making sure that f4 does happen. During the live show we were curious why not king e2 instead of king c1, but then there's a very cute tactic. Black takes, goes back to c4, and after rook takes b7, black has long castles, attacking the rook and also creating a threat of rook d2 check. And in this position it's just important, obviously, not to blunder the rook on h8 after check and takes. So black goes rook e8, and the machine suggests that because of the weaknesses of things along the second rank, black is fine. So the king goes back, Vishy plays king e7, b3, knight d6. And here we were making an argument during the live show that it might make sense to include g2, g4 first, to play e5, not allowing knight f5. But the computer suggests that after rook a d8, e5, knight f7, knight e4, and b6, black will have enough counterplay on the king side eventually. And in more general terms, in particular the position after e5, knight f5, which is what happened in the game, is very, very resembles a great deal all kinds of endgames from the Berlin. In particular, you can discuss a very specific endgame. Let's say in the Berlin you play castles, we make all the prescribed moves in the Berlin, d5, knight f5, queen d8, king takes d8, let's say knight c3, h5, h3, king e8. I'm not doing this in the proper order, but it doesn't really matter for the purposes of this demonstration. Let's say rook d1, bishop b6, bishop g5, bishop b7, we go rook d2, black takes on g5, knight g5, king e7, knight e6, fe. And if you compare this structure with the structure that they had in the game. Obviously, there are some differences on the king side, and also h7, h5 has not been played yet, which is very relevant, of course. But generally, it does look like a burning endgame very much. Magnus plays g4, knight h4, rook hf1, and this is an interesting turning point here, because White obviously is aiming his entire plan on playing f4 or 5 as early as possible. And there is a way for Black not to allow it here by playing rook hf8, just putting a hard stop to the immediate f5, also creating a threat of knight g6. White goes rook f2. If you play rook ad8, you basically get the same position they got in the game. It's a fine position for Black, but I was looking for a way to completely, to get something else altogether and maybe improve. And you can play h6 first. It's important in many variations to take the pawn, the g5 square under control. And here, if White plays c3, compared to the game, this is a big improvement, because after this trade of rooks, f5, takes, rook f8, f6 check. Black has a number of ways to make a draw here, but the easiest one is actually to go king e6. There's no knight g5 check anymore, fg, and just rook g8. And these two weaknesses make Black's position completely safe. So I think after h6, White has to play rook fd2 and go into this knight ending. And here, I think had the king already been on e3, this knight ending is very, very dangerous for Black, potentially maybe even lost. But because the king is so far away, you can force White to push f5 sort of earlier than he would ideally like. And in this position, I left the machine running for a decent amount of time. And it just says this is a draw. Because Black at some point starts getting a ton of counterplay against the White center, there's all kinds of weaknesses you can provoke. And in particular, the king cannot really, because of knight f4 ideas, the king cannot go to either d3 or e2 because you lose the h3 pawn. But I think if you show this position to a human chess player and don't give him any hints on what this is, he could be quite concerned with Black about entering this, because if this doesn't work out, if let's say somehow f5, f6 check works for White, you could just be completely lost here. You could lose this position without a fight very, very easily. So I think making an argument that Vishy should have allowed all this is extremely difficult and unfair. Vishy played rook ad8, also a very logical move, but it does allow the following sequence: takes f5. And once again, here I'll show you what the machine thinks is best play. The machine suggests you should play rook d5, f6 gf. Now the best move, according to it, is knight takes f6, ef, king f7 doesn't impress it at all. And you can sort of understand why, because it will be difficult to establish proper control over this structure. Black has all kinds of rook e5 ideas. The white pieces seem to be slightly sort of hanging in the air here, and the pawn on f6 might turn out to be a weakness and not a strength. So knight f6, rook e5, knight h7, and here I tried figuring out why, and I still cannot really tell you, but the only move that the computer thinks completely equalizes here is b6, b5. Sometimes I think with the intention of playing b4 and completely fixing the white king queen side. But honestly, understanding why it's so important to play b5 in this position was very, very difficult for me. But it does suggest that after b5 the position is just completely equal. Once again, going for this for a human player, you are allowing white to connect, two connected outside passers. Yes, they are passive. Yes, they are very well controlled by the knight on h4. Yes, the knight on h7 is probably misplaced. All of these things are true. But once again, if you're wrong and the knight gets out, and let's say if you imagine the same position with the knight straighted off, you're more or less resigned here with black. So really not an easy choice once again for Vishy to make. So he took on f5, gf, rook f8, f6, takes. All of this is forced, more or less. And in this position, once again, the move Vishy made is a significant mistake. But I think it's very, very difficult to make what the machine suggests is best move, which is king d7. You're basically sidestepping all the tactics. I think the idea of this move is not big. Obviously, black would prefer the king closer to the passer on f6. But you need to step away from all kinds of tactical opportunities that white has. And in this position, it's a very weird one. For instance, after rook f4, knight g6 and rook g4, the only move that maintains balance, but it is, according to the machine, complete equality immediately, is the move rook h8. And the point of that is that if black plays king e6 immediately, you run into knight g5 check, and you cannot take because of this knight takes h7 fork. So you go rook h8 sort of well ahead of events, and you want to play king e6 next move. And this is very, very equal according to the machine. Already a very difficult consideration to make. And if white goes rook g1 instead of the king d7, the best move to make here is h7, h6, and just allow white to occupy the 7th rank and go king c6. And once again, here the machine suggests counterplay with knight f3, knight g5 is enough to make a draw. Also, I think something you can very easily get quite scared about. But mistrusting the machine on this is kind of stupid. As well, white can play c2, c4, a kind of a waiting move. And then black goes knight g6 and slowly consolidates rook d1 check, king e8. Once again, you don't want to be stepping into this check. But king e8 appears to hold here. But as mentioned, king d7 is a very, very difficult move to make. Vishy played king f7, which is a lot more natural. And here it was Magnus's turn to go slightly wrong. The computer suggests that rook g1 is very, very strong here. The obvious calculation here is that you cannot play rook g8 really, because white takes on h7, trades rooks, and then goes after the queen side. And this is quite clearly a lost position for black, because you lose the pawn on c7 and the pawn on h3 is even still alive. So after rook g1, you kind of have to go king e8, rook g7, rook f7. And here there is a position which looks very promising. Knight g5, rook f6, rook h7. Now black needs to make a strong move, rook g6. Knight e4, knight f3, rook takes c7. I thought this has to be winning, but the machine actually suggests that after rook h6, it's very possible that white ends up not winning this game. Because the pawn on h3 is kind of doomed, or you have to play a very ugly move, knight f2, and the king is close to the weaknesses on the queen side. So instead of this, the machine goes rook g5. It's important to stop knight f5. Let's say knight g6, rook h5, knight f8. And here, for instance, it's notable that you should not play king d2, because once you allow rook d7 and king f7, your advantage disappears. What you should be playing here is a combination of, let's say, h3, h4, king b2, rook h6. And the big point is, the moment black tries to unpin himself by playing rook d7, let's say after king b2, you go knight g5, and black is once again completely out of moves. You can't come closer to the pawn with the king, the knight has no moves, and white once again continues slowly improving after maybe eventually playing f7 check and taking on h7. And yeah, this is quite unpleasant for black. Instead, Magnus played rook f4, which is the most obvious and the most natural move in the position. But it probably doesn't win. And from this moment until, and this is move 29, from move 29 till move, I think, close to 50, Vishy showed me personally, what I associate with him very much, and that is perfect defense. Perfect, absolutely flawless defense. He goes knight g6, knight g2, knight g5 check, king g6, rook g4 just wins for white, because after knight e3 you have knight e6 check, takes, and black cannot play this pawn endgame because it's just completely lost. So knight g6 is the only move, knight g5 check, king e8 the only move, rook f1. This is the best try for white, and I will be kind of passing over some decisions here, because Magnus played also quite well, but a lot of the advantage has actually been missed by him playing rook f4, move 29. h6, rook, knight e6, rook f7, black wants to go king d7, Magnus stops it. Here once again, the computer says maybe the objectively the tightest draw here is achieved by doing this, but I don't think anybody ever does this, so it's hard to criticize. Rook f6, takes, king f8, takes, knight f4, h4, knight g6. Black's counterplay obviously will be connected with the fact that the pawn on h4 is weak and there's a lot of counterplay against it. Rook h1, rook f7, a very clever move taking away the c7 square from the knight on a6, creating a threat of rook, apologies, rook a7. And it's very difficult to activate this knight properly, and the pawn is constantly a source of trouble. The machine suggests that maybe starting with a4 was more precise. But then it says king e7, knight c7, king d7, knight b5, and simply rook f6. It's important to establish this setup where the rook is covering the entire sixth rank and doesn't allow, let's say, something like king c6, rook e1, which would be a big trouble for black. So you play rook f6 first, let's say, rook f6, king b2, king c6. And once again, it looks like white has an extra pawn for not very much, but the machine just utterly fails to find any way for white to improve this position. I left it running for, once again, a decent chunk of time, but it just continues going, rook h2, rook h1, rook h3 in some order. There's never a threefold repetition against the machine, of course, but it doesn't appear to be making much progress here. So I have a feeling this is probably closer to a draw than it is to a victory for white. Magnus instead played h5 first, knight f4, a4, king e7, knight c7. And here once again, black could have gone for the same line with king d7, knight b5, rook f6, more or less the same setup. But Vishy on move 40, but he did have a decent amount of time here, so he could evaluate things properly. Correctly just goes after the h5 pawn. Knight d6, rook e7, king b2. Nothing is achieved if you play knight c4 instead. Black just plays rook e6. Once again, this setup where the rook holds everything. So king b2, rook e6. You could also just take on h5 here. There was really nothing wrong with immediately picking up the pawn on h5. White can't really make much progress. And it's also worth noting that if white gets very frisky and actually goes for some kind of a race against the h-pawn, black is generally, at least in computer's assessment, never really worse at all, because the h-pawn is actually very, very dangerous. But rook e6 is not a mistake. If you go knight c4, black will now take on h5. And I think what Vishy was trying to achieve here is to actually block the king's path towards the b5 square with white's own knight. And Magnus, probably because of those precise reasons, goes knight f7 check, king f5. And here he realized, I guess, that after king c3, black can just play rook f6, and he just chases this knight forever, and it's an immediate draw. Which is why he played rook d1, freeing the knight up. And once again, there is really no reason for black not to take on h5 immediately. It appears to be making an immediate draw. Either rook h1, king g6 is perfectly safe for black. Rook d5 check, king g4, knight e5 check, king g3 is also perfectly safe for black. White can win everything on the queen side by playing a5 here. ba, rook d5 check, king g4, rook takes c5. But the position after knight g3, rook c5 and h5, I think you just instinctively trust that black will not lose this, because the outside passer is just a lot faster than anything that white can use against it, and yeah, black will not struggle too much here. Vishy instead played king g4, which is also fine, king c3, and took with the king. And here I was wondering if the best practical chance Magnus had was to go for some kind of a race like this. King c4, king g4, king b5, h5, let's say knight e6, h4, we take, black goes h3, we take, black goes h2. And here I still think that maybe against people who are easily scared, this would have been a better choice than what Magnus actually did. But objectively, black is just completely fine here. One important point is, if you play b4 trying to save tempi on going rook h1, rook takes h2, black can play rook e2, and you actually have to give up the pawn on c2, because if you play c4, you can just suddenly resign after a very simple but a very nice little tactic. Rook e1, rook takes e1, knight d3, and this is a queen. So you go rook h1, black goes king h3, and let's say b4, king g2, we take, we go b5. And the computer suggests that you basically never ever win something like this, because black is always in time to give up the knight for some of the pawns, let's say from the d8 square, and the rook will pick up the other two. But white also obviously risks nothing at all here. Magnus instead goes rook h1 check, king g6, knight takes h6. Vishy makes a very precise move, rook e4 here, which makes sure that the knight doesn't come out. And honestly, at this point, we thought that Vishy is exceedingly unlikely to lose this position, because the knight is just so completely cut off that you should not be running almost any risks at all. Magnus goes king b2. And here, already you could just play knight e6, locking the knight down. Let's say rook h2, knight d4. And it's just impossible to suggest any kind of improvement for white here. I think black holds this position without, frankly, breaking much of a sweat, because white is playing sort of without the knight on h6. It cannot be picked up because black cannot really hope to contain it, but black contains it with incredible ease. And yeah, the machine just gives, I think, absolute equality here, and doesn't even suggest that white is better by a smidgen. But the move that Vishy made, rook e2, is also perfectly fine. Black obviously wants to go knight d3, knight b4. If you go king c3, black just returns the rook to e4, and we have seen this position on a previous move. You can also maybe make an argument for knight d5 check, because king d3, knight f4 check is a repetition. So yeah, king c3 is not a move. The knight has to go to g4. And this is, I think, the most puzzling moment of the entire game. Because what Vishy did is still a draw, but it's very difficult for me to figure out why he didn't just play king f5 here, continuing to pressure this knight on g4. And after both, let's say knight h2, knight d3 check, and knight b4, let's say knight f1. And here, basically, the computer suggests that as long as you don't blunder any of the forks, and you go king e5 or king f4, you're just completely fine. So white is not at all better here. And the same applies to rook g1, check, knight b4, king c4, let's say rook c2, king b5. And you can make more or less any sensible move here. Let's say rook c3, take on b3, go knight d3 check. This is just a draw. There's really nothing left to play for. Instead of which, Vishy makes the move knight d3 check and allows king c3 and rook h2. And I've seen people say that rook takes h2 was a mistake, but I think at this point Magnus probably will be able to make black nervous at least. Although, yes, you can make an argument that rook e4 was maybe a more comfortable draw than rook takes h2. But this is still a draw. Takes, king f5, knight f3. Once again, it was possible to play king e6, so that after knight e1 you go king d6, and after knight d3 you have the square d5 available to your knight, and you can set up this construction, which appears to be slightly more stable than what Vishy ended up with. But king e4, which is what Vishy played, is not a mistake either. Knight e1, king d5, knight d3, knight c6, knight f4 check. A very nice try, which we thought was a kind of a practical punt, but as a matter of fact, if you play something like king e5 and allow king c4, you are actually already completely lost. This is a very nice little sacrifice of a full knight for a bit, and the pawns just run, and black can resign. Vishy correctly plays king d6, king c4, and here he goes knight a7. It was also possible to go king c7, check, king b7, c3, and here the only move that doesn't lose is king a6. But I think you can make it once again by excluding everything else, because you realize that this position you will not hold. So you go king a6 to stop the king from coming to b5. You also create a fine little threat of knight e5 mate, and this is a draw. But knight a7, which is what Vishy played, is also perfectly fine. And here Magnus shuffled for a bit and went back to d3. And this is maybe the one big surprise in this endgame. It's not where black missed a draw, but I couldn't during the game really figure out why Vishy did not play b6, b5 here. My guess is maybe he was scared of the move a5. But after a5, black just goes king c7, and there is no efficient way for white to stop knight c6. For instance, after king e4, black goes knight c6, king d5, c4, and we end up with a 1 against 0 endgame, which is obviously a draw. So b5 more or less forces white to play something like king c3, takes, knight c8, and generally 2 against 1 is a reasonably straightforward draw in positions like this. Instead, Vishy continued passing. He went king c7, king e4, knight c6. The knight got transferred over to c4, and Magnus finally pushed c3. And we enter sort of the final phase of the game, because it looks like this should be nothing at all, but in fact there's a lot of Zugzwangs here available for white. And for instance, after knight e7, king g5, if you give a check from the previous square, c6, you have already lost. After king e6 check, you have to give up the d5 square, and now after knight b7, a very cute maneuver just wins on the spot. White goes a5, black has to take, and now you go knight b2, and you transfer this knight over to c4, a4, pick up the c5 pawn, and then eventually this pawn will also fall. So knight g6 check, the move that Vishy played, is strictly the only move here. King f5, knight e7 check, king e6, knight g6, and here Magnus played a5. And this is where a draw was missed by Vishy. He needed to, I'm sure he calculated the entire thing, but he needed to correctly assess what's happening after ba5. White goes king d5, knight f4 check, king takes c5, knight e2, and now of course not knight takes a5, knight c3, this is a trivial draw. White goes knight d6, and the pawn endgame after takes, knight b5 check and takes, is winning for white, because you are just in time to establish the opposition here by, let's say, playing before king b7, king b5. And the same applies to a4, king takes a4, king b6, king b4. But after knight d6, you can go knight c1, white has to give this check, king b7, knight d4, and there is the only move you can make here, which is king a6. You obviously do not want to allow king b5. But after king a6, we once again end up with an endgame where 2 is facing 1. And 2 against 1, as I said, they look scary, but they are a draw. And that was basically the final calculation that Vishy needed to complete in this game, because ba5, knight a5, once again here, knight f2, knight f4, knight e2 is an immediate draw, because if you play c4, your knight gets stuck. But Vishy played b5, and this position is now lost. It's actually lost after more or less any sensible move for white. I think the most narrow and direct victory was knight d6. If black plays b4, you play c4, and then regardless of where the knight goes from f4 in this position, you just pick up every single pawn and you win. So black has to play king c6, and now you go a6, king b6, you take on b5, black has to take, you give a check from c7, and then you play king d6. And there's really no defense against knight d5 check, then c4 check and king takes c5. And after c4, b4 is winning, but also this position, it turns out I have learned something completely new for me today, that the doubled c-pawns, at least in this configuration, I don't know what happens if the knight is much closer to the king, but in this configuration, white is apparently just very easily winning with the double c-pawns here. But Magnus played knight e3 instead, and this will require one final precise calculation from him. Knight f4 check, knight e2, knight d5 check. The easiest to understand is king b7, king d6, so you can quite clearly see you have to resign here. And arguably the trickiest would have been the move king d7, which would require from white to figure out that you can play a6, king c6. And now white wins by playing simply king e6. And against anything black can do, you just go for this maneuver. King e7, king g8, king c8. And once it lands on c8, you just play a7 and you win. For instance, before c4, check, and we go. And black has two moves here to stop this plan, and he still cannot do anything at all about it. It is still going to be a full queen on a8. And the move that Vishy made also requires precision from white, because black basically wants to play b5 before here, fixing the pawn on b3, and then going knight c1 and picking it up. And you have to stop it. But once again, playing b3 before here is very logical, but still, I think the position after c takes before, and knight c1 is a little bit of a study, because I have a feeling that the following moves are more or less only moves that win here. Knight e7 check, king b7. You cannot allow knight d3, obviously, so you play king d4. You also create a threat of king c5. Black gives a check. You have to go to c3 to have here the move king b4. Black goes knight c1, and here you go knight d5. And basically you are threatening knight f4 to catch this knight on c1. It goes to e2, you play king d3. If it goes to g3, now you do a bit of a pivot. You play knight c3, king a6, king d4. And once again, black is in a bit of a zugzwang. He has to allow the king to c5 and the pawn will fall. And if instead black goes knight c1 check, you go king d2, knight a2, king c2. Black plays king a6, because if you play king c6, white plays a6, and this is a zugzwang. And despite the knight taking on b4 with check, it's nowhere near close enough to the a8 square. And this is a queen, so black goes king a6. And now a very, very beautiful little sequence. White goes king b3, obviously not allowing knight before king a5, check, king a3. We create a threat of knight c7 check and knight takes b5, king b7. Black is almost home dry, right? Knight d3 or knight e2. And now we go knight f4, and then we go king b2, and then we go king takes c1. So a very, very beautiful variation, which many of these moves are the only moves that win for white, which is quite remarkable. I don't know how much of it Vishy understood, but he decided to check something else. I don't know if he actually thought this gives him drawing chances, or if he just didn't want to sort of live through this misery. But he takes on c3, knight takes, c takes b4. And here only one move wins, but it's a move, once again, you arrive at by the process of elimination. It's a move knight e2. White is aiming to go knight d4 and knight b3, supporting the pawn on a5. And it's also very important after b4, b3 to have the immediate check to pick this up, because if, let's say, you go knight e4, black will play b3, and he will be in time here to attack the pawn on a5 and make a draw, which obviously is something that white would very much like to avoid. But he does avoid it by playing knight e2. And after knight e2, Vishy just resigned, because there's really no hope left. A very, very impressive, in a way, game by the world champion, who I had a bit of a discussion about these types of endings with friends and colleagues, and Vishy really is one of the best defenders in business, and he normally would not lose a position like this, I'm pretty sure. And trying to explain why this happens in games against Magnus, it's difficult, but I think part of the reason is that apart from the defensive skills, you also need skills to continue asking the correct questions. Let's say from somewhere here, I think a lot of people would not really believe anymore they have too many winning chances, because the position really is just a draw if black plays correctly. And to continue thinking of ways to ask questions, thinking of ways to demand micro decisions which require precision from black, it's also a very specific skill. And Magnus is arguably the best in the world at that. And also because there are so few people that can ask those questions properly, people actually have much less experience defending positions like this against a persistent persistent inquisitor, so to speak, than you would think. And even somebody like Vishy, who obviously also got tired towards the end of this game, and you can find all kinds of natural reasons for it. But I think it's also the fact that this part of the game doesn't get trained nearly as much as some others. In terms of what happened in the tournament, the situation after this game and the other results of the round looks like this. Magnus is in the clear lead now. 4 wins, no losses, 7 out of 10. Behind him is Anish Giri, who lost in round 1 with the white pieces to Jan Nepomniachtchi and won 4 games since and made 5 draws. All 4 victories Anish achieved in this tournament so far have been achieved with the black pieces, which is really, really remarkable. And there's a 3-way tie for 3rd to 5th between Nepomniachtchi and Anand, who both lost in this round, and Dean Liren, who is having a very solid tournament, but in recent rounds, Ding is finding wins to hard come by. Tomorrow, well, already today, frankly, is a rest day, and the tournament will restart on Friday with the last 3 rounds on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday. All games will start at 1:30 Central European, so consider watching the live broadcasts. I think they are quite good, if I say so myself. And I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks for watching. This has been Peter Svidler for Chess24.